few months ago, I made a video about what would have happened if Aaron Rodgers didn't get hurt. This one guy, Oakley, said, "You should make this a series," and I replied with, "Appreciate it, man. For you, I will." Since he commented that 4 months ago, I have not made it a series and I have not done a video on it. So today, I'm going to be going through and I'm going to be making what would have happened if Kirk Cousins never got hurt in the 2023 NFL season, his final season with the Minnesota Vikings. Let's see what would have happened. Kirk Cousins went down halfway through the season in Week 8 against the Green Bay Packers, tore his Achilles. Very unfortunate for the Vikings and Kirk Cousins, but let's just see what would have happened if that didn't happen. In Week 9, following the Achilles tear, Josh Dobbs was traded to the Minnesota Vikings, and after only being on the team for 3 days, he went to Atlanta and beat the Atlanta Falcons on the road. So I'm assuming if Josh Dobbs won that game, Kirk Cousins would have won that game. So I'm giving that game to the Minnesota Vikings again. In Week 10, Josh Dobbs went on to beat the New Orleans Saints back home at Minnesota. So, of course, I'm going to give that one to the Minnesota Vikings again, assuming Kirk Cousins was still playing. Next week on Sunday Night Football, the Minnesota Vikings went to Denver to take on the Denver Broncos. And in that game, they lost by one singular point. They lost with Josh Dobbs. He didn't have a good game, made a couple of mistakes. And I'm thinking that a Kirk Cousins-led Minnesota Vikings team would have been able to get them at least one more field goal to win that game. So I'm giving that game to the Minnesota Vikings. That's making them 7-4 up to this point in the season. Moving on to Week 12, the Bears upset the Vikings in Minnesota on Monday Night Football. Kirk Cousins beat the Bears earlier in the season in Chicago. Yeah, I know the Bears improved throughout the season, but they scored 12 points. That game was just terrible. I think Josh Dobbs threw like 4 interceptions. So I'm going to go with the Vikings on this one. I think if they had Kirk Cousins, they would have won this game. Then they had their bye in Week 13. Week 14, they had a thriller. Vikings versus Raiders, where 3 total points were scored in the fourth quarter, and that was it. And the Minnesota Vikings won that game. I'm assuming if Kirk Cousins was on the field, more than 3 points would have been scored, and the Vikings would have still won that game. In Week 15, the Vikings lost to Jake Browning and the Cincinnati Bengals in overtime in Cincinnati. I'm sure Nick Mullins didn't play terribly, but I'm giving that game to Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins, I think last season would have been a top 10 quarterback. I mean, he was playing like it when he was healthy. So assuming that he would have played better than Nick Mullins played in that game, I'm going to give that game to the Minnesota Vikings. Week 16, they take on my pride and joy, the Detroit Lions, home in Minnesota. This is the game that won the Lions the division for the first time in 30 years. However, I say if Kirk Cousins was on the field, look, our defense was getting shredded in that game. Nick Mullins threw like 4 interceptions again, but Justin Jefferson still had close to 200 yards. Kirk Cousins is not going to be throwing 4 interceptions against the Lions secondary, so I'm sorry. Detroit Lions would have not won the division that week of the season. So I'm giving that game to the Minnesota Vikings, making it a 10-game win streak. Now, finally, after all of this time, we have a loss for the Minnesota Vikings. Coming in Week 17, the Vikings got smacked by the up-and-coming Green Bay Packers. Look, the Packers were on the rise at this point in the season. They lost a couple bad games, had a close game with the Panthers, but now they're taking that surge to the playoffs where they eventually beat the Dallas Cowboys. They beat the Vikings originally 33-10. I don't think Kirk Cousins is coming back from that, so I'm giving that game to the Green Bay Packers. And then to close out the season in Week 18, the Minnesota Vikings took on the Detroit Lions again, and this time I have the Lions winning in Detroit. With that, that makes the Minnesota Vikings 11-6 on the season, which would have won them the division for the second year in a row, breaking my heart. They are the 3 seed in the NFC, making the Detroit Lions the 6th seed in the NFC. Let's see what happens in the playoffs. So the NFC playoff picture would have looked a lot different. Okay, not that different. The Eagles would have still played the Buccaneers. I still assume the Buccaneers would have blown the shit out of the Eagles. And the Cowboys and the Rams would have played in the playoffs, which would have been a really interesting matchup. Of course, yeah, the Cowboys did not play well at all on Wild Card Weekend, but they seem to never play well against the Green Bay Packers. Plus, the Packers were up and coming. Jordan Love was playing outstandingly. Is that a word? I'm going to give this game to the Dallas Cowboys. I know it's not a popular take, but I say they don't lose to a 7th seed. Another interesting thing, the Green Bay Packers wouldn't have made the playoffs in this scenario. Their playoff run would have never happened. And then, of course, the Minnesota Vikings home playoff game would have come against my Detroit Lions. Oh my gosh. It's going to break my heart, man. I want to pick the Lions to win this game, but I'm going to be smart. I'm going to be unbiased. It's going to break my heart, but I'm going with the Minnesota Vikings. They would have won in the playoffs. So moving on to the divisional round of the playoffs, the Minnesota Vikings would have had a date with the Dallas Cowboys in Dallas. And we know what happened last time the Minnesota Vikings played the Dallas Cowboys. It was not pretty. Granted, these are both very different teams, but I'm giving this one to the Dallas Cowboys. So, in short, the Minnesota Vikings would have made it to the NFC divisional round had Kirk Cousins not been hurt. Another interesting thing to think about, who knows if Kirk Cousins would have still been on the team with the Vikings the following season. But if the Vikings were looking for a new quarterback position, they had like the 28th draft pick in the league, meaning that J.J. McCarthy probably would have ended up being a Denver Bronco, and Bo Nix probably would have fallen out of the first round of the NFL draft. Hell, the Vikings could have ended up with Bo Nix as their starting quarterback if Kirk Cousins had chosen to go to the Atlanta Falcons, which is, it's interesting to think about. And with that, that concludes a video. Oakley, I hope you're happy, man. 2 episodes is officially a series. I will see you all in the next video. Again, if you want to see me make a prediction for your team for next season, a terrible prediction might I add, let me know which team I should do next in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care.